Russia fights until it can't. It has never backed down from a war without at least 500,000 battlefield deaths. Right now, we're probably only at about 50,000. But if the Ukrainians can pull this off, you're looking at 2.5 million Russians in Crimea, plus the entire military force suddenly be completely exposed and largely unsupplied. If Ukraine is going to win, this is how it's going to happen. Will they pull it off? No idea. The Russians have used every opportunity in this conflict to underperform. This should have been over 4 months ago. But the Ukrainians have stepped up, the West has stepped up, and the Russians have missed every opportunity. So this is a fair fight now. On the left, we've got a climate map of the Russian space. In the middle, the green, that's the Russian wheat belt. That's where you live if you're in Russia. That's 99% of the population. It's not so cold that your nose will freeze off if you go outside on October 1st. You wait till November, you're screwed, but October, you're okay. If you go to the right, to the north, to the blue, that's tundra, that's Tagai. Nobody lives there. If you go to the left, to the south, that's desert. No one lives there. Now, when the Russians look at this, they get really depressed because of the beige. Wide open territory that's completely economically non-viable, but brackets everywhere that they live. Territory where it's very easy to run a Mongol horde or a German tank division through. Completely indefensible. On the right, you've got a population center. You can see it lines up with the green. So the Russian way of dealing with this isn't great. You can't even build a road network through this territory. The economic activity per acre is so low. It's rail or nothing. So what they try to do is expand past the green through the beige to get to these geopolitical barriers, mountains, deserts, seas, and then forward position static military forces in the access points between. When the Soviet system existed, they controlled every single one of those access points. When the Soviet system fell, the Russians went from controlling all of them to one. Everything that Putin has done since has been about getting a military footprint in each and every one of those zones. This is Nagorno-Karabakh, this is the Crimea War, this is the Georgian War, this is the Kazakh intervention. They now have footprints in 5. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it's not that Ukraine is in an access point, but it's on the way to 2 of them. So the Russian goal here has always been not just to conquer all of Ukraine, but then to use Ukraine as a military launch pad to those 2 next sections. And those next sections include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania, NATO allies all. This is how the Russians see the world. They see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they are not wrong. Now, who here is not from Texas? Texas is not as big as they think. The scale of what the Russians feel they need to do to survive is mammoth. It's something we just have a hard time processing as Westerners. So let's talk about where we are right now. Now, the war obviously started with this massive thunder run to Kiev when the Russians tried to believe their own propaganda that the Ukrainians were going to welcome them in. And when it didn't work, when on the 3rd day of the war, that 40-mile-long train of equipment stalled on the road to Kiev, different countries drew different conclusions. In the United States, we're like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war. We can totally kick their ass in a conflict. And then all the generals and the admirals had a nap and some bourbon and really thought about it, like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. We could totally kick their ass. But they see this as a war for their existential survival, which means that every tool is on the table. And if we get to the point where the Russians can overwhelm Ukraine and then come for NATO, we know we will have to fight them. And we know we will beat them on the conventional battlefield easily. And we know they will use nukes. So we can't let that happen. So every piece of equipment that we can train the Ukrainians on, they get as soon as we can possibly get it to them. That was our lesson. The Russian lesson was that, okay, our propaganda was wrong. They're not going to welcome us in. And that means the Ukrainians themselves are a problem. And so we're going to fight the war we know how to fight with artillery. And we're going to advance slowly through eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. And we are going to specifically target every piece of civilian infrastructure we see, especially agricultural infrastructure. Because if we destroy the capacity of this territory to support a population, it will self-separate into 2 groups. One group will become refugees, they will leave, we will never have to worry about them again. Anyone who stays is clearly a fighter and they can be shot on sight. So slow artillery advance, you bring in the Wagner mercenaries to kill anyone who's left. We don't know exactly how many people are dead in Ukraine right now. It's probably about 500,000. We now believe that at least another 500,000 has been forcibly taken from the occupied territories and redistributed into Siberian territories. This is about the destruction of Ukraine as a nation. Now, what's going on this week? For the last 2 months, the Ukrainians have been advertising that they're about to launch an assault on Kherson, and that is right over here. It's the only territory that the Russians have grabbed that is on the west side of the Dnieper River. And in anticipation for that, the Russians have relocated roughly 1/10 of their forces from the Eastern Front to the Kherson province. And you'll notice that there are 2 bridges, only 2, between Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine in this part of the country. You have to go all the way up to Zaporizhzhia, which is up here, to get to the next bridge. So 2 access points. All the troops have to come and go through those bridges. All the supplies have to come and go through those 2 bridges. Well, the Ukrainians have damaged both so that heavy equipment can't go them at all. In fact, on one of the bridges, the road span has now been destroyed. So the Russians now have a huge troop concentration in this area with no support and no resupply. It's too soon to say that the Ukrainians are going to win this, but as of day 4, it seems to be going pretty well for them. But then the Russians also were subject to a surprise attack when the Ukrainians opened up a second front back in the Donbass in the east where those red arrows are, because that's where the Russians pulled their forces from. So 2 active fronts right now. If the Ukrainians are successful here, their next target is going to be right there. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge. This is the only rail connection between Russia proper and the occupied territories. All those dotted lines are rail lines, and you'll notice that everything that's in the Donbass doesn't connect to the southern front or to Crimea. It all has to come in through Kerch. If they can destroy that one bridge, the Russians, who don't function well with trucks, who have to have rail, suddenly don't. There's one more little aspect. Take a look at Crimea. Look at this blue line. That's a canal. That supplies all their water for their entire agricultural system. It's 2.5 million people in Crimea. It's the biggest concentration of Russian forces. The sluice gate is in Kherson. If the Ukrainians succeed here, they will have turned Crimea from a strategic launching point with the primary rail connection to being at the very end of a very long and a very exposed road link. That doesn't mean it doesn't have implications. If you take the 3 belligerents together, treat them as a single economic entity, which I think we really need to in wartime, everything in the first column, they are collectively the world's largest supplier, second largest in the second, and so on.